Communication, as we said, is all about a dialogue and an exchange. It's not one-sided and it's not one way. So we need to provide better value, more meaningful value in the way in which we communicate. In the same way that we have precision medicine, we need precision marketing.
Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Sonika Garcia.
And I'm Brad Davidson, and this is Breaking the Code,
a podcast that takes the BS out of behavioral science for marketers and non-marketers alike. We hope to arm you, our listeners, with the tools you need to make sense of behavioral science and to help you apply it to your work as communication extraordinaires. Welcome back, everyone. This is our first episode of the new year, 2024. And what better way to kick off the first episode than with a guest? So very excited to introduce our first guest of the year. Welcome, Vernon. I'm going to do a quick intro. I'm going to try to make it quick. There's so much to say about Vernon, but I'll try to make it succinct. So Vernon Bainton is a scientist, a clinician, a technophile, communicator, and above all else, insatiably curious. Vernon is an internal medicine and anesthetics provider by training, but then decided to move into the pharma industry in medical and commercial roles and has since transitioned to healthcare communications. And he now leads the medical and scientific function of Havas Lynx. Outside of his work at Havas, Vernon is part of prestigious mentorship programs. He teaches. He is the co-founder of the Health and Happiness Lab, which redesigns better tools to measure the subjective well-being of what actually matters for people living with chronic illness. And we're so excited to have him on. He's such a great asset to our team at Havas. And yeah, welcome, Vernon. We're so excited to have you.
All right, well, Happy New Year, and thank you so much. Sonika, you seriously need to do my introductions from now on.
She's available. She's available for recordings and shout outs. Yeah, Happy New Year, everyone. So I'll jump in for 1 second. So I've known Vernon for 7 years now, I believe. A little longer than that maybe. But met Vernon my first day on the job, and he is a doctor. He is always fascinating, like many doctors. He has many interests outside of just the pure applied bioscience that is doctoring. He really is quite interested in technology, and also got to know Vernon well, actually, ironically, because he lives in England, during pandemic, because we worked on something together called Behind the Mask, which was a sort of ethnography, a virtual ethnography, where we had doctors around the world sort of giving us video journals about their experiences through pandemic. And it became really clear really quickly that the primary emotion was distress and concern for themselves and for their field. And that's what we really want to talk about. So without further ado, let's just jump right in. Sonika, you want to start firing away questions?
Yeah, I think, something that we talk a lot about in, all of our episodes and the work that we do within medical anthropology is around culture. So I'd love to start off with a question on culture. So Vernon, how is the culture of doctoring evolving and what impact does it have? So in your opinion, what do we mean by culture? What's important to know? And then how is professional culture really distinct?
Oh, there's so much to unpack. So the way I think about culture is the way people behave, and there's emergent relationships between them within groups, right? But we have to understand the context of what we're talking about here. And healthcare providers and health systems have been evolving, since we've set them up and over many decades. But what is radically different is the rate of change in more recent years. So just going back 50 years, mid-1970s, psychologist Freudenberger, great name, first described burnout in a professional setting for people working in caring roles that had a high physical and emotional toil, literally describing overworked doctors back in the 70s. But since then, we've had some fundamental sort of seismic changes that have been undergoing globally, internationally. So last year, we commissioned a piece of research called Healing the Healers, and we looked at 8 markets, the US, Europe, Asia Pac, 2,500 healthcare providers across multiple specialties, primary care as well. And what we basically demonstrated and showed was that subjective well-being of healthcare providers was at an all-time low. And what we've got is a real maelstrom, this perfect storm of staff shortages. We've seen this in the news. We know that there's a massive gap, particularly in specialists training, and we know that there's understaffing, there's underfunding. We've just gone through COVID, and as Brad said, we were initially exploring the impact that that was having at the time. And there's still the aftermath, there's still the moral injury, there's still backlog. On top of that, medicine is a competitive, highly competitive environment, and that used to exhibit itself in some perhaps toxic traits, being highly competitive. Yeah. And I'm being quite gentle with my wording there, but in certain environments it could be a little bit toxic. And coupled with this sort of reluctance for healthcare professionals to ask for help because they were labeled a failure if they did so. They were put on this high, we had high social status, right? But there's components to that meant that, you had these high ideals. And so finding things difficult and struggling meant that people, were not willing to ask for help, were not able to ask for help. And there's not a lot of help available. On top of that, you've got increasing qualitative expectations of the general public about what they expect from health services and healthcare providers. And that's ratcheting up. And you've got this loss of autonomy and control because decisions are being made protocol level or from an insurer and less on the individual. So the individual healthcare provider, we see this evidence, they have less sense of control and autonomy and mastery in their own role. All of those things, we could talk about all of them, but fundamentally showing that there's some real challenges in health systems that are common across different localities.
Yeah, I just want to touch on something. The last thing you said, to your point, we could talk about all of them, like, going back to the 70s, it was mostly men. How many of them were socialized into asking for mental health services? None. I think there's, in the culture of medicine, in the culture of training, psychiatry itself is sort of downgraded. I got some great stories about psych residents being beaten up at grand rounds and stuff like that. Like, I think there's a lot there, but the one that you said that is most interesting to me as an anthropologist is this loss of agency, because I think it's part of a larger sort of loss of sense of purpose by healthcare providers. I was raised in a medical family. That's not unusual, but I was also then started interviewing people in the 90s, right? So I've been doing this for 30-something years, and I have noticed absolutely that one of the most definitive changes in how people talk about their work as doctors and as nurses, frankly, is lack of autonomy and loss of purpose. That at one point, doctors sort of ran hospitals. The joke was hospitals are a place where doctors share a parking problem. Like they sort of ran their own franchises within a hospital setting, but they had a lot of autonomy. That didn't give them a sense of purpose, but it did give them a sense of self sort of efficacy that is completely lost. That things happen to them now. It is directly tied to resilience, whether or not you feel like you have agency over your own future. It's why it's so terrible being a refugee. And I'm not trying overtly to compare being a doctor to being a refugee, but that loss of sense of purpose or control, and that the people who you report to have different goals in mind than you do. That's something that I hear a lot, that, medicine is no longer about making as many people healthy as possible. And it's certainly not about giving doctors a happy place to work. It's about making money. And that has been catastrophically disconcerting. Again, I'm underplaying the word there, but it's been catastrophic, I think, for the mentality of doctors. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, our fundamental premise is really quite simple. We work in an environment and in a sector where we're looking to launch innovative medicines, technologies, devices. Doesn't matter if it's a software for medical service or it's the latest new cancer drug, right? But our fundamental contention is to communicate to people. That's what we do. We need a relationship with the individual. And our basic hypothesis is if those healthcare professionals in those situations are under that much stress, strain, and challenges, they're not going to be receptive to, or we need to alter the way in which we're communicating to them. I mean, from the research last year, we had 75% of the oncologists we spoke to believes that pharma doesn't understand their current needs. And they're our primary audience.
Right.
Fundamentally, we are failing them, and actually we're failing them in our clients' interests as well, if we don't get that relationship and that trust better.
And what's so fascinating about that statement is this is at exactly the same time that things like the checkpoint inhibitors and CAR T and some of the most advanced cancer fighting technologies have been launched in the last 10 years that have revolutionized oncologists' ability to do their job. And so it's this contradiction of like, we've provided you with fantastic tools. We, being the pharmaceutical industry writ large, like everyone involved in sort of drug development, have provided incredible tools. Like we've quintupled survival in lung cancer. It's incredible. And yet at the same time, doctors feel like no one's listening to them and pharma doesn't understand them. That's a really incredible gap to me.
Yeah. And I'm just curious, from the data that you have, Vernon, what was like the top 1 or 2 areas of improvement that doctors say that pharma should explore in our communication?
It fundamentally boils down to being a communication relationship and what is meaningfully valuable to them, right? So when you look over the recent history of what we've done, in a promotional and marketing sense, it was just share of voice. It was just key message, key message, key message. And if you could just overwhelm people with that content, it would at least be memorable, if nothing else, right? That didn't engender trust, value, usefulness in any way, shape, or form that the clinicians just don't have the time for. So you've seen this sea change. We've seen a move towards the MSL roles and the medical education side. And it's fundamentally important that you talk about oncology, right? The oncologists need industry to help with the deluge of new evidence and data, right, and how to assimilate it into clinical practice. So they're actually on one hand saying, help us, and the other hand saying, not that way. And that's the landscape that we've got to navigate now. And we're actually at a really interesting intersection, and we're at a wonderful place. And I'm very hopeful, actually. At this point in time, there's a lot of negative news around and a lot of doom mongering, but actually there are so many potential positive opportunities to do things better and differently. And I think that's a wonderfully exciting time.
Doom mongering is going to be the name of my next podcast, probably. That'll be a passion project. So, so we've talked a lot about the industry relationship. We've talked a little bit about the sort of conditions of labor. I'm very interested in that. I feel like the conditions of labor have so fundamentally changed that it's a completely different job in some ways. But the other thing I want to talk about, because doctors have mentioned this considerably to me, and it's a quote I got. I'm curious your take on it. We've discussed this offline in a few different ways, but it's this quote that like we used to be priests, now we're technicians. I can explain what I think that meant in the context of the interview, but I'm just curious if you could react to that.
Yeah, absolutely. My training was not that long ago, but it was a little while ago. And I've been out of clinical practice for a fair while. But it was always regarded as a vocation and not a job. And actually, there are so many things. There was the Hippocratic Oath. There was the fact that you were being trusted with people's most intimate health issues, and the professional standards by which we had to be set and be regulated by. All of those things put the role in a particular echelon within society, right? And a very high regarded one. On multiple fronts, that has been eroded and changed without equivalent replacement, if you see what I mean. So
I do, yeah.
Previously, you had autonomy and you could make decisions and it was down to you, etc. And now these things are being imposed or set objectively or for other reasons. They might not be in your clinical best decision, but they may be set because of cost constraints or some other factors. So again, it goes back to that loss of control. The role itself has changed wildly, or the expectations put on the role now has changed wildly, and there hasn't been the reform to keep up. So the training hasn't been reformed in accordance.
Right.
We haven't got to grips yet with the new panoply of allied healthcare professionals, right? And we need them, and it's a team sport, healthcare, absolutely. However, when you have a group of doctors feeling loss of control, and you have other allied health professionals taking some of those roles or taking some of those tasks, yet it has to be managed really carefully so that it doesn't further erode and frustrate the different stakeholders. And I see this an awful lot on social media, and you get fiefdoms and tribalism even within the professions or subdivisions of professions.
Oh, you make it sound like that's surprising. Look, no. That's not surprising. That there are fiefdoms within professions is as old can be.
Exactly.
But to your point, I mean, I think part of the problem is medicine, like you say, medicine's a team sport. It is. My wife's a nurse, and she's a med-surg nurse, and there's handoffs, and everybody is touching these patients and whatever. The one thing you can't do as a team sport is relationships. And I think what this doctor was getting at when he said we used to be priests and now we're technicians was also that we used to have meaningful relationships with the people who we served. And he was going back, I've got my whole thing on nostalgia, so like the good old days that never were. But there is a truth to the idea that doctors knew their patients better, were better counselors, were more trusted, occupied a priestly role. Who but a priest or a doctor could ask you about your sex habits, your bathroom habits, are you having an affair? Are you taking drugs? Do you have an STD? Like, those are very, 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 very private questions, and you could trust your doctor to keep that stuff safe. And again, it's a push and a pull, right? I think doctors are no longer in a position to get to know their patients. And I think that's what this guy was lamenting, right? He was talking about what sometimes is called conveyor belt medicine. I've heard people refer to it as doc in a box, right? Where you're doing like 10 minutes, 30 patients a day, 60, 50 patients a day, whatever it is, right? Throughput. You're not going to get to know people very well if you're running your practice like a Jiffy Lube. On the flip side, though, I think something that doctors haven't really acknowledged as much is that loss of trust is in part the same way that priests have lost trust, which is they've violated it. And I'm not saying doctors violated it. I'm saying a small handful of doctors violated that trust in very public ways. And that in many ways has led to people in general rejecting authority, right? So people don't look at teachers, doctors, policemen, Congress people, you name it, right? Things that people used to trust as the pillars of society have been proven at a very small percentage, but a significant one, to be not worthy of that trust. And I think we're at a moment right now where institutional trust is at an all-time low, and I don't know how doctors get it back.
You bring up a couple of things there that I think are interrelated and are really challenging. So, of course, there's been these high-profile, comparatively rare,
Very
high-profile
rare.
accounts where
Admittedly, very rare, very high profile. Yes.
High profile where patients suffer. But particularly if there is collusion or things are hidden or there's whistleblowing, or problems against whistleblowers, which seems to be the common case. So you get that erosion of trust so much more. It's so much more compounded because
Right.
you have groups hiding those. That trust, that dripping erosion of trust on the one hand, and then patients on the other wanting to see somebody today, now, immediately,
Right.
and don't have that relationship. They are also then looking for an immediate answer. So you now see we've got digital channels, we've got so much health education that could be out there, but actually we're getting health inequality is getting worse. Health literacy is actually getting worse. So you've got doctors in good faith trying to help a patient who may be misinformed because they've sought other sources that are not credible or not scientifically correct, or are inaccurate or wrong. And we know that misinformation and disinformation is a massive challenge in widening health inequity gaps. So you've got trust challenges on multiple fronts. So if the doctor-patient relationship is falling down, where do those people get trusted information from? And similarly, on the HCP side, they've got this deluge of new evidence, all these new exciting things coming through all the time. And how do they manage their way through that, keeping up to date and revalidated and all of those other great things to show that they're practicing the best practice, whilst dealing with things they shouldn't have to deal with as a consequence of these interdependent sort of factions?
For sure. Well, listen, I think trust is a two-way street. I think that the demands of a consumer-first society, patients matter more than doctors. It reflects things like students matter more than professors, right? I don't think we think of these places as places where professionals exercise their profession in a comfortable way anymore. Nobody cares if doctors are happy in hospitals. Nobody cares if professors are happy. Nobody cares if lawyers are happy. I'm not asking people to care. I'm just saying it used to be part of the deal was, a hospital is a comfortable place for doctors to do their job. Nobody even talks about that anymore. When you talk about what success is, we talk about patients. Doctors have been written slightly out of the equation, and it's fine. I'm not crying big crocodile tears, but I'm crying a little bit of crocodile tears because you've mentioned subjective measures, objective measures, right? People leaving the profession, suicide rates are through the roof. It is absolutely the case that doctoring is in distress without any question across the Western world, the industrialized world. So, I think this issue of trust is one we might have to come back to on a longer podcast. As I said to Sonika and Gabe before we started, Vernon and I have never stopped a conversation on time. We've had many meetings and they always go over, but there's just so much to unpack here.
So what do you see as some of the biggest cultural changes or shifts at the moment, Brad?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, again, we've both been in it for a long time, but I've been in it as an observer, which is a really interesting position to be in, right? I've never had a responsibility for a patient, but I've been around doctors training for 30-something years. And the biggest shift for me, the biggest shift in how the profession is seen by professionals themselves is it's gone from something that was almost like a priesthood where you took vows to, you mentioned the Hippocratic Oath, sometimes they do the Oath of Maimonides, but all of these were really secondary to this idea that was given to you by the teachers at teaching hospitals that you have an obligation to society if you take a medical education to exercise that education, to serve people. That if you're going to go into medicine and not practice medicine, you should not go to medical school. You should let somebody who's going to go be a doctor go to medical school. And when I talk to doctors and older doctors, and even younger doctors who were trained by older doctors, everyone says that they heard this. I know you've said you've heard it. I'll let you react to that, right? But this idea that like, if you left medicine, you were shunned, literally shunned. You had wasted an education. Now, you are not only not shunned, if you leave practice of medicine to go into, say, medical communications, you're going to get 50 emails in your inbox going, how do I join you, from your colleagues, right? And I think that no one gets mad at a barista or an architect for leaving their firm, right? But people got mad at doctors for leaving the profession, and they don't anymore. And that, to me, is the absolute shift. That is, to an anthropologist, that is the quintessential shift from something that is a life role to an occupation. And that's a very interesting shift because, to your point, who else deals with sex, death, poop, all of that stuff in the most intimate possible ways? And we've sort of turned it into a Jiffy Lube type job, which I don't know if they have those in England, but it's when you drive your car in 5 minutes, they lube up your car and then you're gone, right? We've gotten very good at treating bodies like mechanical things. I think the spiritual aspects are lost, and that's why it's possible to view it as a job, not a calling, as it were. But we've talked about this. I'm dying to hear your response, Vernon.
I think I'm going to use a comparatively recent example, to show how to do things differently and better. So,
well, first, do you agree with that analysis? I'm just
curious. I do agree. Look, 20 years ago, when I left clinical practice, give or take, or started moving away from it, there were very few roles. You worked in a teaching hospital, as I did, or you were a district general hospital, community-based, or your primary care. I didn't. I went to industry, and from there realized I had transferable skills, and my vocation was in communications. Fast forward, 15 years, I was lucky enough to become a mentor on the NHS Clinical Entrepreneur Program. One of my team is from that program, and we've been a stalwart supporter of it. So if you have a group of, by definition, academically high achieving, competitive, talented people that are very frustrated and struggling in their jobs to get the value, as you talked about, and the meaningfulness and the purpose out of it, they want to change, and they either want to apply innovation and make change happen, or they look to other, to commercial industry or work privately, or to do other things. So the NHS CEP program is the largest global workforce entrepreneurial program, and teaches everything from how to start your own business, to setting up projects, to services, to finance, team management, pitching, investment, but it goes on and on, of which I teach the marketing side and the communication side of things. And it was set up to keep brilliant, bright people both working in the NHS and innovating for the NHS, with the NHS, and in partnership with the NHS.
So a recognition of this, yeah.
Of course, it makes sense to do that, to keep those people that are going to otherwise probably leave or do something different, to actually be generating higher value for themselves and both for the health system itself.
Well, that speaks also volumes to the fact that they are catching up, right? Because when I first started studying this stuff, one of the main complaints of early, like recent graduates and people going through the program is the people training them had no idea of the environment that they were launching into, right? This was during the HMO revolution. And they were like, they're talking to me about setting up a practice and it's not going to happen for me. They don't know what the world is like out there. So it's refreshing to hear that.
Okay, thanks so much, Vernon and Brad. This has been a really interesting conversation. I think our listeners will definitely come away from this realizing that doctoring is changing. Doctors are practicing in a very high stressful environment, in a completely different environment than potentially they started off in. They do need more from pharma, and we need to rethink the way that we're communicating with doctors. I think let's end on, Vernon, what's some advice that you have for communication strategists, creative minds on how we can better do our jobs to better serve the needs of doctors?
Yeah, absolutely. It would be easy to talk about the challenges, and we could do this all day long, right? But actually, let's get solution orientated. So look, we've been using persuasion techniques and communication techniques to the time immemorial. It's just we have better omni-channel approaches, and we can communicate with people in much more real-time ways, right? Through digital media particularly. But we still fall back to the tried and tested, ethos, pathos, logos, and kairos, trying to think about people from their ego, from their logic, from the right time and the right approach, and from some empathy. Communication, as we've said, is all about a dialogue and an exchange. It's not one-sided and it's not one way. So we need to provide better value, more meaningful value in the way in which we communicate. In the same way that we have precision medicine, we need precision marketing and precision education. We need to communicate with people in the right time, right place, right way that is useful to them. That is just a hygiene. That is how we have to operate, and it's how we have to be operating, and actually be thinking about them and their world over the lifetime of their patients and the disease states and all these, and thinking in the way that doctors and clinicians think, rather than just thinking in the way that we want to sell product or have historically just sold products. So it is much more about an exchange of communication rather than one way. It's about the idea, and it's about using creativity in its broadest sense. For us, creativity is problem solving. It's connecting to people. It's being empathetic. It's being humanizing, and it's being useful, and it's being purposeful.
I think some of the best work the network does comes out of the English side of things. I think you've done some incredible work on, the naloxone ads that you guys did are amazing, and useful and purposeful. And I think, showed them to my wife, who was an EMT. She thought they were the best ads she'd seen, right? So I think we can solve problems, and we can provide a useful voice. In fact, I think it's a necessary voice in this sort of cacophony.
Agree wholeheartedly. It is necessary, and it's about having all those voices together actually and bringing them together, because that's the only way those outcomes are going to get better. You can fiddle in part with lots of different pieces, but you won't change the outcomes. And actually, it's about aligning things. It's about getting alignment.
It's about getting the team playing together, right? Like, let's go team. So
yep, awesome. Okay, well, we are at time. Thanks so much, Vernon, for your time. I know you're incredibly busy. This was a really, really important conversation. I think our listeners are going to get a lot out of it. So thank you so much, Brad. Thank you.
Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year.
Vernon, we've been lining you up for a long time. You are busy because you're good.
I know.
Keep an eye.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah.
Amazing. All right, until next time, everyone, I'm Sonika Garcia.
And I'm Brad Davidson, and this is Breaking the Code.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Breaking the Code is a podcast by Havas Health and Use Medical Anthropology Department. Created and produced by Brad Davidson and Sonika Garcia. Content editing done by Catherine Rossi. Post-production audio editing done by Gabriel Allen Cummings. And inspiration by all of you. Thanks for listening and your continued support. If you enjoy these episodes, we would love to hear from you. Please leave a rating and subscribe. Until next time.